In the summer of 1260, a letter arrived in Cairo written in golden ink. The ink was deliberate. Gold meant supreme confidence. Gold meant the sender did not consider a reply necessary, only acknowledgement. The letter was addressed to Qutuz and the people of Egypt, and its words were designed to end the war before it began. From the King of Kings of the East and West, the great Khan. You should think of what happened to other countries and submit to us. Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains, our soldiers as numerous as the sand. Fortresses will not detain us, nor armies stop us. Your prayers to God will not avail against us. Qutuz read the letter aloud to his council. Then he had the ambassadors arrested, dragged into the streets of Cairo, and cut in half at the waist. Their heads were mounted on the Bab Zuwayla gate for all to see. Hulagu's letter was displayed beside them. Now look at the board as it stood in that summer. The Mongol Empire controls approximately 16% of the Earth's land surface, from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It is the largest contiguous land empire in human history, larger than Rome at its peak, larger than Alexander's conquests, larger than anything before or since. It has been expanding without interruption since 1206. In 54 years, it has never stopped. Baghdad fell in February 1258, 1 week of systematic destruction. The Caliph, spiritual leader of all Sunni Muslims, heir to the Prophet's authority, was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses because Mongol tradition forbade spilling royal blood directly on the ground. Damascus opened its gates without a fight in March 1260. The Mongols stand at the edge of Africa. Egypt is the last major Muslim power standing. Now look at what stands between the Mongols and Egypt. The Mamluks are not like any army the Mongols have previously encountered in the West. They are not feudal levies or conscripted farmers or tribal warriors fighting for clan and plunder. They are slave warriors, purchased as boys between 8 and 12 years old from the Kipchak Turkish steppe and the Caucasus region, stripped of every identity they possessed, remade through years of brutal training into something specific, the perfect cavalry fighter. They study the Quran and they study tactics. They drill with the bow until their fingers bleed. They practice sword work until the movements are instinct. And here is the detail that every serious account of this battle eventually reaches. The Mamluks come from the same steppe as the Mongols. They grew up in the same martial tradition. They understand Mongol tactics not from books, but from blood memory. They are the mirror image of the force they are about to face. Now look at the window. In late 1259, the great Khan Mongke died while campaigning in China. Mongol law required all princes of the blood to return to Mongolia for a succession council. Hulagu Khan departed Syria with the bulk of his army. He left behind a rear guard under his most trusted general, Kitbuka Noyan, a Nestorian Christian Turk who had helped conquer Baghdad and watched Damascus surrender. The most reliable modern scholarship, Reuven Amitai at Hebrew University, the leading authority on this period, places Kitbuka's cavalry at approximately 12,000. Not the overwhelming force that had terrified the Muslim world for 2 years. 12,000 veterans in hostile territory, far from their supply lines, with horses that had been grazing on Syrian semi-arid terrain for months. Qutuz assembled approximately 20,000 men. The two forces were roughly equal in number. The Mongols had never fought an enemy with numerical parity in open ground. They had always had overwhelming superiority, or they had avoided the engagement. 3 commanders before the story begins, Qutuz, Sultan of Egypt, born a prince in Central Asia, enslaved by the Mongols when they destroyed his homeland, rose through the Mamluk system by competence and ruthlessness to seize power in a coup in late 1259. The Mongols made him a slave. He has just declared war on them by mounting their ambassadors' heads on the city gate. Baybars, Mamluk general, born Kipchak Turk on the steppe, sold into slavery after his parents were killed. Trained in Egypt, exiled from Egypt, wandered Syria and Palestine as a fugitive for years before returning. The man Qutuz needs to fight this battle. The man Qutuz cannot fully trust. Kitbuka, Mongol commander, veteran of Baghdad and Damascus, a Nestorian Christian leading an army in a war against Muslims, loyal to a Khan sitting in Persia. He has been told the Mamluks are manageable. He believes it. 3 things about what comes next. The standard story of Ain Jalut is that the Mamluks stopped the Mongols because they were better warriors. The problem with that story is that the Mongols had better numbers in most previous battles and won anyway. Something else decided this one. And the historians who have spent careers on this question do not agree on what it was. Baybars spent years as a fugitive in Syria and Palestine before Ain Jalut. He wandered through the Jezreel valley, learned the hills, the springs, where the ground narrowed and where cavalry could not maneuver once committed. When Qutuz needed someone to design the ambush, Baybars was the only man in Egypt who knew that valley the way a man knows the place he nearly died in. The question is how he ended up there in the first place. 51 days after the battle, Qutuz was dead, murdered by Baybars during a hunting trip. The man who made the decision to fight, who rode into the breaking left flank without his helmet, who saved the battle at its most dangerous moment, did not survive long enough to see Damascus recaptured. The man who killed him then became one of the greatest rulers in Islamic history. We have to decide what to do with that. Before the army left Cairo, Qutuz stood before the religious scholars who had condemned his war taxes as un-Islamic and said something that history has preserved. Not because it was eloquent, because it was true, and because what happened after, it was the kind of thing that gets preserved whether anyone intends it to or not. Baybars was born somewhere on the Kipchak steppe in approximately 1223. His parents were killed by the Mongols during their campaigns through the Barli tribal territory. He was sold in a slave market at Sivas, in Anatolia, and eventually purchased and brought to Egypt, where he entered the Mamluk training system. He was good at it, exceptional at it. He rose through the ranks with the specific combination of physical skill and political instinct that the Mamluk system rewarded, and that the Mamluk system also, eventually, punished in the men who had too much of it. He fell out of favor. The details are complicated and the sources are not entirely clear, but the result is documented. Baybars left Egypt under circumstances that made staying dangerous. He went east, into Syria, into Palestine, into the territories that the previous decade had shuffled between Crusader, Ayyubid, and increasingly Mongol control. He was a former Mamluk commander with no army, no patron, and no safe place to return to. He wandered for years. The Jezreel Valley is a triangular plain in northern Palestine. It stretches approximately 50 kilometers from Mount Carmel in the west to the Jordan River Valley in the east. The valley floor is relatively flat and open, the kind of terrain that any commander trained in steppe warfare would recognize immediately as favorable cavalry ground. Room to maneuver, room to sweep, room to execute the encircling movements that the steppe cavalry method required. But the valley is surrounded on all sides by hills and mountains, Mount Gilboa to the south, the hills of Lower Galilee to the north, Mount Tabor to the northeast. The hills are not bare or windswept. They are covered with trees and rocky outcroppings, the specific combination that can conceal a large force from anyone moving through the valley below. A man on the valley floor looking up at those hills sees trees and rocks. He does not see what is in the trees and rocks unless he already knows it is there. At the eastern end of the valley, where the hills close in from both sides and the open cavalry ground narrows to something much more confined, there is a spring. The locals call it Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, because the tradition holds that this is where the biblical David killed the Philistine giant with a stone from the creek bed. Water sources in this landscape are rare enough that armies move from spring to spring. Any force marching through the Jezreel Valley would pass Ain Jalut. There was nowhere else to water the horses. Baybars knew all of this, not from maps or reports. From years of moving through this ground on foot and on horseback, sleeping in these hills, learning where the paths ran and where they ended, understanding which positions on the slopes above were visible from the valley floor and which were not. He had moved through this terrain as a man who needed to know it for immediate practical reasons. He knew where an army could hide. He knew it the way a man knows the place he spent years trying not to be found in. At some point, the political situation in Egypt shifted enough that returning became possible. A new sultan, new arrangements. Baybars came back with his veteran troops, homeless and dangerous, and Qutuz, who could have had him killed and whose advisors suggested exactly that, kept him alive. He needed him. Baybars returned to Egypt carrying something no other commander in the Mamluk army possessed. He had not brought it deliberately. He had accumulated it during years of wandering that stripped everything else from him. He had learned a valley. He had learned it so thoroughly that he could plan an ambush in it from memory, could position a force in its hills with confidence that they would not be visible from below, could calculate exactly where the ground narrowed enough that cavalry committed to a pursuit would find themselves unable to maneuver out of it. He had learned it without knowing he would need it. The exile that had taken everything else from him had given him this. He did not know yet that this would matter. The Mongols had been trying to build an alliance with the Christian powers of the Middle East for years. The logic was straightforward, and the diplomatic groundwork was real. Hulagu Khan's wife was a Nestorian Christian. His general, Kitbuka, was a Nestorian Christian. The Ilkhanate had welcomed Christian auxiliaries from Armenia and Georgia throughout its campaigns. The Crusader states and the Mongols shared a common enemy in the Muslim powers of the region. From the Mongol perspective, the alliance made strategic sense, and the outreach had been consistent. The Crusader leadership at Acre had to decide what to do with that outreach. They had been in the Holy Land for nearly 2 centuries. They had fought the Muslims in every configuration available to medieval warfare. They had allied with some Muslim powers against others, signed truces and broken them, negotiated prisoner exchanges, and launched campaigns that achieved nothing except casualties on both sides. They understood the politics of this region the way that only people who have been fighting in the same place for multiple generations understand it, which is to say, incompletely, partially, and with the specific bias of their own survival needs. When they looked at the Mongols clearly, they saw something the diplomatic logic had partially obscured. The Mongols had sacked the Crusader city of Sidon after a dispute, demonstrating that Mongol friendship was contingent and that the conditions attached to it were not always legible in advance. The Mongols had demonstrated at Baghdad and across Syria that submission meant survival only on Mongol terms, and only for as long as the Mongols found the arrangement convenient. If Egypt fell, the Crusader states were not going to become Mongol allies. They were going to become Mongol territory. Qutuz sent representatives to Acre. The negotiation was direct and the agreement was specific. The Crusaders would maintain official neutrality. The Mamluk army could march through Crusader-controlled territory without being harassed. Supply bases could be established near Acre. Food, water, and provisions would be accessible for the army moving north. The people who had been Mamluk enemies for decades provided the food and passage that sustained the army, marching to save Islamic civilization. Neither side examined the long-term implications of this arrangement with any care. There was no time for long-term implications. There was only the immediate calculation. The Mongols were a larger threat than the Mamluks today, and the army moving through your territory was the army currently positioned between you and the people who had burned Baghdad. The calculation was correct. It was also the last significant decision the Crusader states would make in their favor. The Mamluk army marched out of Cairo in late July 1260. It passed through Gaza and turned north along the coast, moving through territory where Crusader soldiers watched from their positions as 20,000 Mamluk cavalry rode past. Some of those soldiers had fought Mamluks. Some had lost friends to Mamluks. All of them were now watching the same force march through their territory toward a battle that, if it went wrong, would remove the only remaining obstacle between the Mongol army and their own walls. They let the army pass. They opened the supply bases. They provided what Qutuz had asked for. The army continued north, resupplied and intact, into the territory where Baybars had spent years wandering without an army to command. The same hills, the same valleys, the same springs that had marked his route during the years when having a destination was a luxury he could not afford. He rode through that ground now with 20,000 men behind him, and a sultan who needed him, and a plan that depended on a valley he had learned the hard way. The Crusader soldiers watched them go. They did not know that the force they were watching would, under the sultan it was about to create, systematically eliminate every Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Caesarea, Arsuf, Jaffa, Antioch. The port of Acre itself, 31 years later, would fall to the state that Ain Jalut made possible. The force that Acre helped sustain would eventually destroy Acre. They let the army pass. The army passed. The hills of Palestine rose ahead of them, and the valley waited at the end of the march. Cairo, the night before the army marches, not the night before the battle. The battle is weeks away, in a valley Baybars has already mapped in his memory and Qutuz has not yet seen. This is the night before the departure, the night when the preparation has been completed, and what remains is only the morning, and everything the morning begins. The heads are on the Bab Zuwayla gate. Qutuz ordered them placed there. The Mongol ambassadors who arrived bearing Hulagu's golden letter, who read it aloud in court and waited for the submission they had received from every previous recipient, were arrested the same day. They were taken into the streets of Cairo and cut in half at the waist. Their heads were mounted on the gate. The letter was displayed beside them. Take this slowly. There is a kind of decision that cannot be undone by the person who makes it. Not because all decisions are eventually irreversible, which they are, but because this kind of decision is irreversible immediately, in the moment of its making. Mounting the heads of Mongol ambassadors on a city gate is not a negotiating position. It is not a statement of intent that can be walked back through subsequent diplomacy. It is the answer. The Mongols know what it means. Qutuz knows what it means. His council knows what it means. There is no further exchange required. He is standing somewhere in Cairo on the night before the departure, and the heads are on the gate. The treasury has been taxed. This required an argument. The religious scholars of Cairo issued legal rulings condemning the taxes as un-Islamic. Qutuz summoned them to the great mosque and stood before them and said what the situation required. For God's sake, when we have expelled the enemy and Allah grants us victory, if we do not return every dirham to its owner, then judge me by the Sharia and do with me what you will. The scholars withdrew their objections. The money was collected, the army is assembled, 20,000 men. The Crusader arrangement at Acre has been negotiated. Baybars has accepted the vanguard command and the conditions attached to it. Everything that could be prepared has been prepared. The window that Mamluk Khan's death created is open and will not stay open, and the morning is when the army moves. He is a man who was born a prince in Central Asia. The Mongols came and destroyed his homeland. They sold him. He was sold into the Mamluk system, and he was good at it, better than most. Good enough to rise, good enough eventually to seize the Sultanate in a coup in late 1259. He has been Sultan for less than a year, and he has spent that year managing a treasury dispute and a political alliance with a general he cannot trust, and a negotiation with people who have been his enemies for decades, all in preparation for a war he declared by executing the other side's diplomats and mounting their heads where every person entering or leaving Cairo could see them. The heads are on the gate. The sources do not record what Qutuz thought on this night. What they record is what he did in the morning. They record the army departing, the march north, the engagements that followed. They record his actions at the moment the left flank broke and his response to it. They record everything he did. They do not record a night in Cairo when the preparation was finished, and what remained was only the fact of the morning. Baybars is somewhere in the same city, preparing the vanguard, planning the movement through the hills he learned during years of having nowhere to go. The man Qutuz needs is here, in Cairo, on the same night, alive because Qutuz decided the political risk of keeping him alive was smaller than the military risk of facing this battle without him. Both men understand the arrangement they have made. Both men know what the arrangement does not say. Two men in the same city on the same night. One of them will not survive what comes after the battle. The other will build everything the battle makes possible on the foundation of what the first man started. The gate is in the direction Qutuz is facing, or it is not, but he knows it is there. The heads are on it. The letter is beside them. The answer to the golden ink and the language about soldiers as numerous as the sand is visible to anyone who passes through, which means it is visible to anyone who leaves Cairo in the morning with the army, and anyone who watches them leave, and anyone who watches what happens after they are gone. He is not looking for someone to reassign the decision to. He made it. The morning is coming. Margaret does not exist in this story. The daughter in this story is the outcome, not a child in a fortress, but a world that will be different because of what this man does in the next few weeks, and he does not know yet what it will look like, or whether he will live to see it. He is standing in Cairo. The gate is in one direction. The army is in another direction. In the morning, both of those things will be behind him. He does not speak. The army leaves at dawn. Qutuz and Baybars had been rivals before they were allies. Not openly. The Mamluk system was too politically sophisticated for open enmity between commanders of their rank, and the consequences of visible rivalry were too predictable to risk. But the tension was real, and the sources do not conceal it. Baybars had fled Egypt once already, under circumstances connected to the political instability that preceded Qutuz's rise. When Kitbuka's Mongols captured Damascus, and Baybars found himself in Cairo with his veteran troops and no territory and no patron, several of Qutuz's advisors made the straightforward recommendation. A general of Baybars's ability and ambition, arriving at a moment of crisis with a personal army, was a threat that should be eliminated before it became a problem. Qutuz kept him alive. The negotiation was direct. Qutuz offered command of the vanguard, the force that would ride into the Jezreel valley as bait, engage Kitbuka's cavalry, draw them into pursuit, and retreat in controlled disorder toward the hills where the main army waited. The vanguard commander would face the Mongols first and most directly. He would need to maintain discipline under fire while appearing to break. He would need to retreat convincingly without actually running. He would need to know exactly where he was going when he turned his horse around. In exchange, Syria. When the battle was won, Baybars would have his lands back. Baybars accepted. Both men understood the full dimensions of the arrangement, and neither stated them. Qutuz needed the best battlefield commander available for the most dangerous position in the plan. Baybars was that commander by any honest assessment. His experience, his tactical intelligence, his knowledge of the ground, there was no one else in Egypt who combined all three. Giving him the vanguard was militarily correct. It was also politically convenient. A vanguard commander who dies in a feigned retreat against Mongol cavalry is no longer a rival for the throne. Both men understood this. The sources do not record that either of them said it. Baybars accepted the position knowing what it meant in both directions. If the plan worked, he would have won the battle that saved the world, and Qutuz would owe him Syria. If the plan failed, the vanguard would be the first force destroyed, and the political problem Baybars represented would resolve itself without Qutuz having to arrange anything. He accepted anyway. The risk was survivable if the plan worked, and he had designed the plan, and he knew the ground. Qutuz gave him the vanguard because Baybars was the best man for it, and because Baybars knew the ground. He had learned it during the years when he had nothing else to do but walk it. The army continued north. Near Gaza, Mamluk forces encountered and destroyed a Mongol advance patrol under a commander named Baydar. The engagement confirmed two things. Kitbuka did not yet know the full size of the Mamluk army, and the Mamluk army was capable of surprising Mongol forces that considered themselves adequately positioned. Qutuz ordered the march to continue without delay. The window that Mamluk Khan's death had created was not infinite. Speed was part of the plan. By early September 1260, the army was in the hills above the Jezreel valley. Baybars looked at the ground he had spent years learning and began positioning the vanguard. He placed his men where they would be visible from the valley floor. He placed Qutuz and the main army in the hills where they would not be visible from the valley floor. He chose Ain Jalut as the point toward which he would retreat, because the valley narrowed there, and cavalry committed to a pursuit would find themselves in ground that denied the open field maneuver their method required. He had walked this ground as a man with nowhere to go. He was positioning an army on it now. The knowledge was the same. Qutuz needed Baybars. Baybars was better at this than anyone else in Egypt. That is not in question. What is in question is whether Qutuz gave him the most dangerous position in the battle because he was the best man for it, or because a vanguard commander who dies in a feigned retreat against the Mongols is no longer a rival for the throne. Baybars accepted. He understood what the vanguard meant. He also understood that if he survived, he would have won the battle that saved the world, and Qutuz would owe him Syria. Two men who needed each other and could not trust each other. One battle. One plan that required both of them to function exactly as promised. What would you have done? If you were Qutuz, giving the most dangerous assignment to the man you need and fear simultaneously. If you were Baybars, accepting it from a man you intend to outlast. Neither of them made a mistake. Both of them knew exactly what they were doing. Kitbuka received word that a Mamluk force was moving north through Palestine. His scouts had reported the destruction of Baydar's advance patrol near Gaza. The patrol was gone before it could provide useful intelligence about the size of the force that had destroyed it. What Kitbuka knew was that the Mamluks had left Cairo and were moving north. What he did not know was how many of them there were, because Qutuz had been careful to keep the bulk of his army concealed during the march. Kitbuka had approximately 12,000 cavalry, veterans of Baghdad, veterans of Damascus, men who had helped build the administrative structure that now governed Syria from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean coast. They were not a depleted force or a demoralized one. They were professionals who understood their business and had done it successfully for years in circumstances far more demanding than managing a rearguard position, while the main army dealt with a succession crisis in Mongolia. The horses had been on Syrian terrain since spring. Syria is semi-arid. The summer of 1260 had done what Syrian summers do. It had drawn down the grass cover on the hillsides and the valley floors, leaving the kind of sparse, dry forage that horses can survive on. But that does not produce the same energy and condition as the rich steppe grass that Mongol cavalry had been bred and trained to depend on. The horses were not lame. They were not starving. They were simply not the same horses that would have covered 60 miles a day on Mongolian grassland in spring. The letter had promised horses swift as lightning. The horses at Kitbuka's disposal in September 1260 were veterans of a Syrian summer. Rashid al-Din, writing from Mongol sources approximately 40 years after the battle, records that Kitbuka was at Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley when he received the intelligence about the Mamluk advance. He moved south. He brought his army toward the Jezreel Valley because the valley was where the road ran and where the water was, and where any force moving between Syria and Egypt would inevitably pass. It was the logical route. It was the route he would have chosen in any assessment of the terrain. He was not walking into a trap he could not have seen. He was moving toward a position that any experienced cavalry commander would evaluate as favorable ground. Open valley floor, room to maneuver, a spring that would water his horses and serve as a natural reference point for the engagement. What he did not know was that the man who had designed the plan on the other side had spent years walking every hill surrounding that valley. On the night of September 2nd, 1260, Qutuz moved the main Mamluk army into the hills. The force was substantial. The hills above the Jezreel Valley are covered with trees and rocky outcroppings that break up sight lines from the valley floor. A man riding through the valley looking up at those slopes sees terrain. He does not see what is in the terrain unless he knows to look for it. And knowing to look requires knowing that something is there to be found. Kitbuka's scouts reported a Mamluk cavalry force near the spring at Ain Jalut. They reported its size as manageable. They did not report the main army because the main army was not visible from the valley floor. Baybars took his vanguard, approximately 1,000 of the finest Mamluk cavalry, and positioned them where they could be seen, near the spring, in the valley, looking like exactly what a scout report would describe. An advance force, larger than a patrol, smaller than an army, positioned at a water source in a valley they appeared to be holding. One detail that the sources preserve: Baybars had positioned his men so that when the Mongol cavalry deployed and faced the Mamluk position, they would be looking east into the rising sun. The morning light would be in their eyes at the moment of initial engagement. It was a small advantage. It was the kind of advantage that a man who had spent years walking the valley at different times of day would know to use. Qutuz was in the hills above with the main force. He could see the valley floor. He could see Baybars' small force near the spring. He could see the approach from the north where Kitbuka's army would appear. He knew the signal his army was waiting for. He knew what too early looked like and what too late looked like. He waited. Kitbuka's army appeared from the north in the early morning of September 3rd. His scouts reported the Mamluk force in the valley ahead, perhaps 1,000 riders, perhaps slightly more. An advance unit, a vanguard. Kitbuka ordered a substantial portion of his cavalry forward, not his entire army, enough to destroy what appeared to be in front of him. More than enough. Baybars watched the Mongol cavalry deploy in the valley below. He had seen Mongol cavalry deploy before, from the Kipchak steppe where he grew up, from the campaigns he had served in, from the years he had spent moving through territories they controlled. He knew what it looked like when a Mongol force prepared to engage an enemy it considered manageable. The formation, the spacing, the light cavalry moving to the flanks for the opening arrow exchange. He had seen this many times. He knew what came next. He let them approach. The battle opened with the exchange Kitbuka expected. Mamluk cavalry engaged, took arrow fire, returned it. Men and horses died on both sides. The Mongols pressed forward with more force. Baybars' vanguard fought and retreated, and fought and retreated, not in panic, not in disorganized flight, but in the specific controlled disorder that is the most difficult military maneuver to execute. The retreat that looks like breaking without actually breaking. Every soldier in the vanguard knew the plan. They had been told where to go when they retreated. They had been told the hills were occupied. They had been told the retreat would end when the main army came down. They fought with the discipline of men who understand that dying in the next 30 minutes means dying before the trap closes, and that surviving the next 30 minutes means the trap closes around someone else. The Mongols pressed harder. Kitbuka committed more cavalry to the pursuit, seeing what he expected to see: a force that was professional enough to maintain some cohesion, but too small and too outnumbered to hold. The valley floor thundered with the sound of the pursuit. Baybars retreated south, drawing the Mongols deeper into the valley, toward the spring, toward the point where the hills closed in from both sides. He did not look at the hills as he retreated. He did not need to. He knew exactly where he was going. He had walked this ground for years. Every step of the retreat was ground he had covered on foot during the exile that had taken everything else from him and left him with this: the specific knowledge of a specific valley in Palestine, learned at a time when having nowhere to go meant learning very carefully where you were. The hills were where he had placed the main army. The spring was the point he was retreating toward. The narrowing of the valley was the moment when the cavalry pursuing him would find that the ground they had assumed was open had become something else entirely. He had not designed this plan from a map. He had designed it from memory. Qutuz was watching from the hills. The Mongol pursuit had committed substantially. The valley was full of cavalry moving south, stretched out in the loose formation of a force chasing a retreating enemy, attention fixed on the vanguard ahead, not on the slopes above. The moment when acting too early would let Kitbuka disengage was passing. The moment when acting too late would mean Baybars's force was destroyed before the main army arrived was approaching. He raised his hand. He removed his helmet and threw it to the ground. The signal his army knew: no retreat, no surrender. Death or victory, wa Islama. From three sides, the Mamluk army came out of the hills. The Mongols had been in pursuit formation, stretched thin along the valley floor, their attention on the retreating force ahead. The hills that had been empty a moment before were suddenly full of cavalry and infantry moving downhill, the Mamluk war horses on their iron shoes descending the rocky slopes without breaking stride. 20,000 men where there had been trees and rock. The Mongols did not collapse immediately. They were professionals, and they responded like professionals, attempting to wheel, to form a defensive position, to use their discipline to fight out of a trap that had closed around them before they understood it was closing. The fighting was brutal and sustained. These were men who had helped take Baghdad. They did not stop because the situation was bad. Then the left flank of the Mamluk line broke. Mongol cavalry punched through. A gap opened. The carefully designed trap had a failure point, and the failure point was actively widening. Baybars's position was suddenly threatened from a direction the plan had not accounted for, or had accounted for and not solved. The gap was real and growing. Qutuz saw it. He rode into it, without his helmet, so his soldiers could see his face, into the heaviest fighting, into the point where the Mamluk line was actively failing, shouting the call that carried across the noise of the valley. The wavering left flank held. Fresh troops poured into the gap. The Mongol breakthrough stalled. Then the Syrian auxiliaries in Kitbuka's force began changing sides. These were men who had been fighting for the Mongols under duress, men whose cities had submitted because resistance had seemed impossible. They had fought because the Mongols were winning. Now the Mongols were surrounded and struggling in a valley they had ridden into with complete confidence, and the men who had been coerced into their service saw the moment they had been waiting for. They turned their weapons on the Mongols and joined the Mamluk side. Kitbuka refused to flee. His officers urged him to withdraw. The tactical situation had become irreversible. The valley was full of Mamluk forces. The Syrian auxiliaries had changed sides. The pursuit that had seemed like a routine engagement 30 minutes earlier had become a closing encirclement. The professional calculation was clear. The battle was lost. The general's obligation was to survive it, to carry the intelligence back to Hulagu, to preserve whatever could be preserved for the next campaign. Kitbuka refused. The sources offer slightly different accounts of what followed. Some record that he died fighting, sword in hand, in the final press of the battle. Others record that he was captured and brought before Qutuz. Rashid al-Din, writing from Mongol sources approximately 40 years later, preserves an exchange that may be accurate or may be the kind of dialogue that attaches itself to significant deaths in the historical record. What it captures, regardless of its precise accuracy, is something real about the man and the tradition that made him. When the captured Kitbuka was brought before Qutuz, the Sultan said he had shed much blood wrongfully and overthrown ancient dynasties, and now had fallen into a snare himself. Kitbuka's response, as Rashid al-Din records it: "If I am killed by your hand, I consider it to be God's act, not yours. Be not deceived by this event. When the news of my death reaches Hulagu, the ocean of his wrath will boil over. From Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt will quake with the hooves of Mongol horses." It was a threat and a prophecy. Then they beheaded him on the battlefield. Kitbuka was a Nestorian Christian commanding a predominantly non-Muslim army in a war against Muslims, loyal to a Khan who was sitting in Persia, managing the political consequences of a succession crisis. He was a veteran of Baghdad. He had watched Damascus open its gates without a fight and had taken that as evidence that the pattern would continue. He was, by every measure available, one of the most capable commanders the Ilkhanate produced, and he died in a valley in Palestine refusing to leave it because the culture that had made him formidable had also made surrender unthinkable. The same system that produced his competence produced his end. With Kitbuka dead, the Mongol army broke completely. The survivors fled north toward Basin, 8 miles away. The Mamluks pursued without pause across the same rocky terrain where Mongol horses without iron shoes had been losing effectiveness for weeks, while Mamluk horses with iron shoes pressed forward without breaking stride. The ground that had been working against the Mongols since before the battle began finished its work during the retreat. At Basin, the remnants attempted a final stand. They were overwhelmed. By nightfall on September 3rd, 1260, the Mongol force that had entered the valley that morning had been effectively destroyed. The Battle of Ain Jalut was over. The Mongols had been defeated in open field battle for the first time in more than 40 years. Not by superior numbers. The forces had been roughly equal. Not by better technology. Both sides used composite bows and cavalry tactics refined over the same decades of the same tradition. By a man who knew the valley. By a sultan who rode into his own breaking left flank without his helmet. By horses with iron shoes on rocky ground. By 45,000 horses that had been grazing on Syrian semi-arid terrain since spring and were not as swift as the letter had promised. By all of these things together, arriving at the same place at the same time. Qutuz had Kitbuka's head sent to Cairo. It was mounted on the Bab Zuwayla gate, the same gate where the Mongol ambassadors' heads had been mounted 2 months earlier, beside Hulagu's letter, with its promise that soldiers would be as numerous as the sand and prayers would not avail against the Mongol army. The answer to the letter was now complete. The listener can look at the gate and read it. The Mamluk army did not return to Cairo. Qutuz gave the order before Kitbuka's head was cold. North, into Syria, immediately. Consolidate the victory before Hulagu can respond, before the administrative vacuum the battle created can be filled by anything other than Mamluk authority. The army that had marched out of Cairo in late July turned north the morning after the battle and kept moving. Damascus opened its gates within days. The city that had surrendered to the Mongols without a fight in March 1260 watched the Mongol garrison withdraw and the Mamluk army enter and made the same calculation in reverse. The balance of power had shifted. Resistance was not feasible. And the new dominant force was arriving from the south rather than the north. The local population that had collaborated with the Mongol occupation disappeared into the city or fled east. Those who could not disappear faced a different kind of justice from the crowds in the streets. The Mamluks restored order quickly. The message was clear. The occupation was over. The old authority was returning, and those who had bet on the permanence of Mongol power had bet incorrectly. Aleppo followed, then city after city across Syria. The Mongol administrative structure that Hulagu had built, the governors, the tax collectors, the garrison commanders, dissolved as word of Ain Jalut spread east and north. The aura of inevitability that had made cities open their gates to the Mongols was a constructed thing, built from 50 years of consistent victory, and the terror that consistent victory produces. It was fragile in the way that all constructed things are fragile. It depended on the belief that the Mongols were invincible. That belief had been broken in a valley in Palestine in a single afternoon, and beliefs broken that completely do not reassemble themselves from the inside. The heads on the Bab Zuwayla gate told the story. The ambassadors' heads that Qutuz had mounted before the army left. Hulagu's letter beside them, with its promise that soldiers would be as numerous as the sand and prayers would not avail against the Mongol army. And now, sent back from the battlefield at Ain Jalut, the head of the general who was supposed to make those promises real. The letter asked for submission. What it received was displayed beside it on the same gate. The answer to the ultimatum was complete and visible to anyone who passed through. Hulagu received the news in Azerbaijan. Rashid al-Din records his fury. He began assembling a force for retribution. And then Burqa Khan of the Golden Horde, who had converted to Islam and was appalled by the destruction of Baghdad and the execution of the Caliph, declared war on Hulagu. Mongol against Mongol. The resources and the attention that would have gone to avenging Ain Jalut went north to the Caucasus instead. Hulagu spent the last 5 years of his life fighting Burqa. He died in 1265 without returning to Syria. His dream of conquering Egypt died with him, deferred into a future that never arrived. Before it is possible to say that Ain Jalut decided everything, it is necessary to say what the historians say. J. M. Smith, Jr., writing in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies in 1984, argued that Ain Jalut was not the decisive turning point it is commonly described as. Kitbuka had only 12,000 cavalry. The Syrian-Palestinian environment could not support the size of horse herd that Mongol cavalry required. The grass problem was real and structural. 45,000 horses on semi-arid terrain in summer represents an ecological carrying capacity the landscape cannot sustain regardless of who wins the battle. Smith's argument is that Hulagu would not have been able to hold Syria, even if Kitbuka had won, because the horses that made the Mongol method work could not be fed in this environment. Smith is not wrong about the logistics. The grass problem is confirmed by Hulagu's own letter to King Louis IX of France, in which the Khan acknowledges that exhaustion of fodder was among the reasons for his initial withdrawal. The environment was working against the Mongols before Ain Jalut and would have continued working against them after it. But Reuven Amitai, whose scholarship at Hebrew University is the current standard on this period, points to the Battle of Homs in 1281 as the evidence that settles the question Smith raises. At Homs, the Mamluk Sultanate faced a Mongol force of approximately 40 to 50,000 men, an army that represented the Ilkhanate at something close to full operational capacity, not a rearguard weakened by a succession crisis. The Mamluks had approximately 20,000. The result was the same as Ain Jalut. The Mongols lost. If Ain Jalut was a lucky circumstance of reduced Mongol numbers and unfavorable logistics, Homs was the proof that the luck was built on something that held when the circumstances changed. The system the Mamluks had built, the training, the tactics, the institutional knowledge of how to fight the specific force they were facing, worked even when the Mongols came back at something approaching full strength. Ain Jalut was the beginning. Homs 1281 was the confirmation. Together, they mean something that neither one alone could establish. On October 24th, 1260, Qutuz was on the road back to Cairo, 51 days after the battle. The campaign was complete. Syria was back in Mamluk hands. The impossible victory had been achieved and consolidated, and the army was returning to the city that had sent it out. He stopped to hunt. A desert hunt in the open country outside Cairo, a traditional celebration, a moment of relaxation after months of war and negotiation and decisions that had required every part of his attention. He rode ahead of the main group with a small guard. Baybars and his co-conspirators had been planning this for weeks. They closed on Qutuz with swords drawn. The Sultan understood what was happening in the last seconds of his life. He reached for his weapon. It was too late. Baybars struck the killing blow. 51 days. Qutuz had been Sultan for less than a year when he declared war on the Mongols. He had taxed the treasury over religious objections. He had allied with a rival he could not trust. He had sent that rival into the most dangerous position in the battle and watched him execute the plan that broke the Mongol army in Palestine. He had ridden into his own breaking left flank without his helmet when the trap was failing. He had won the battle and consolidated the victory, and was on the road home when the man he had trusted with the vanguard killed him in the desert. Baybars declared himself Sultan of Egypt. He ruled from 1260 to 1277, 17 years. Under his rule, the systematic elimination of the Crusader states proceeded in sequence. Caesarea in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, Jaffa in 1267, Antioch in 1268. The port of Acre, the city that had provided food and passage to the Mamluk army before Ain Jalut, the arrangement that helped make the battle possible, fell to Baybars' successor in 1291, completing the elimination of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The force that Acre helped sustain destroyed Acre. The alliance that made Ain Jalut possible produced the state that ended the Crusader presence in the region it had been made to protect. Neither side had understood the implications when the arrangement was made. There was no time for implications. There was only the calculation that was correct for that day. Baybars also defeated every subsequent Mongol invasion of Syria. In 1261, just a year after Ain Jalut, a Mongol force invaded Syria again. Baybars met them at the first Battle of Homs and drove them back. The Mongols tried again in 1281. The Mamluks defeated them again, at full Mongol strength, with the same result. The system that had started at Ain Jalut held. He is buried in Damascus, in the Zaharia library he built and named after himself. The man who killed Qutuz built a library. Both things are permanently true. The library stands. The killing happened. The victory at Ain Jalut required both men, and one of them killed the other, and the other built everything the victory made possible. There is no version of this story in which that resolves cleanly. One question for the comments. Was Baybars' assassination of Qutuz justified, or was it the murder of the man who saved the world? Tell us what you think. We read every comment on this channel. And if you want to be here the next time a story like this surfaces from somewhere it was nearly lost, subscribe. We will not let the silence win. There is one more thing. 3 questions were asked at the beginning of this story. They have answers now, or as close to answers as the sources allow. The first, what actually stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut? The logistics of the Syrian-Palestinian environment limited the size of the Mongol force available. 45,000 horses on semi-arid terrain in a Syrian summer represents an ecological carrying capacity the landscape cannot sustain. Hulagu himself acknowledged the fodder problem in his letter to the French king. The Crusader supply arrangement gave the Mamluk army an advantage in condition and preparation that Kitbuka's force, far from its base, could not match. The Mamluk army was composed of men who had grown up in the same martial tradition as the Mongols and understood their tactics from the inside. And one of those men had spent years wandering the specific valley where the battle was fought, learning it at a time when having nowhere to go meant learning very carefully where you were. The Battle of Homs in 1281, where a Mamluk force of 20,000 defeated a Mongol army of 40 to 50,000, is the evidence that the system worked even when the logistics were less favorable. Ain Jalut was the beginning. Homs was the proof. The second. How did Baybars end up knowing the valley? He was exiled from Egypt after a political dispute, wandered Syria and Palestine for years as a fugitive, and learned the Jezreel Valley the way a man learns terrain he has to cross repeatedly with no safe destination. The exile that stripped him of rank and army and safety was the preparation that made the victory possible. He did not know this when he was wandering, neither did anyone else. The third. Qutuz was murdered 51 days after the battle by the general who helped him win it. Baybars then became one of the greatest rulers in Islamic history. Both things are true. The sources do not resolve the question of whether the assassination was justified. The political grievance was real. The ambition was real. The outcome for the Mamluk Sultanate under Baybars' rule was better than most alternatives available in October 1260. The historical record holds both facts without resolving the distance between them. That distance is not available for resolution. It belongs to the record. The empires that appear invincible are usually the ones that have not yet encountered the specific conditions that expose the limits of their method. The Mongol cavalry system was optimized for the Eurasian steppe. It required open ground, abundant grass, the remount strategy that gave it the speed advantage that had made it unstoppable for 50 years. When it moved into environments that lacked those conditions, the advantages became liabilities. No amount of discipline or tactical brilliance could produce grass that was not there. The method that had conquered the world encountered a world the method was not built for. The Mamluks did not defeat the Mongols by being better at what the Mongols did. They defeated them by understanding what the Mongols needed and ensuring it was not available. By choosing ground that denied the Mongol cavalry its speed. By preparing horses that could operate on that ground when Mongol horses could not. By using the Mongols' own tactics against them because they had grown up in the same tradition. The victory at Ain Jalut was not a miracle. It was the intersection of specific preparation and specific conditions at a specific moment. That intersection was built by a man who spent his exile learning a valley, and a sultan who chose to fight rather than submit, and 45,000 horses that needed grass the Syrian summer could not provide. Hulagu's letter had promised that soldiers would be as numerous as the sand and prayers would not avail against the Mongol army. The letter was displayed on the Bab Zuwayla gate beside the heads of the ambassadors who delivered it. After Ain Jalut, after Damascus, after Aleppo, after the Mongol administrative structure dissolved across Syria, the letter was still there. And beside it, sent back from the valley, was the head of the general who was supposed to make the promises real. The letter asked for submission. What it received was Ain Jalut. The man who won the battle did not live to see what it started. The man who killed him made sure it lasted.